Hello and welcome to the Symposium. My name's Carl and today I'm going to talk about why I think demanding that someone uses your personal pronouns is inherently unreasonable. So let's start with what the pronouns are for. You never use your own pronouns. You always say I. You don't speak about yourself in the third person as if you're not present. People never use your pronouns towards you. They say you. And people tend not to use your pronouns when in your presence because it's often considered offensive to do so. And in English we have a phrase for this. It's called "Who's she? The cat's mother." It's disrespectful to refer to someone who is present by their pronouns rather than by their name or by addressing them directly. Pronouns are properly used in a context where two people are talking about the same known individual outside of that individual's presence. So you might say, did Carol go to the park today? No, I took her to the lake instead, if it was two parents talking about their baby daughter. Or perhaps, did Mark phone you? No, he texted instead. The she and the he are the pronouns being used, and they're not in the presence of the person, and they're not something that the person really would have much to think about on, because again, they're not even there. So the question is, do I have a reasonable obligation to obey your wishes even when you're not around with regards to how I describe your identity? In this case, your gender identity. But I think more broadly speaking, this would expand to that category of just your identity. Do I have the obligation, a reasonable obligation, to honour it when you're not there? And it's kind of hard to see why I would. Now, if I like you, then I might want to do that. That might be a choice that I would make for myself. But if you're not there, you don't know what I said to that other person. And so I don't see how it can affect you in any noticeable way that we might, like in the case of misgendering, that I might have had a conversation with someone else in which you personally were misgendered. If you were offended by this kind of thing, it would require either my conversational partner or a third party to tell you that we had misgendered you, for you to know. And then it would essentially be like, second-hand offence, would it not? So on what grounds could you reasonably object to this? It seems that the only reason one would use like Z or Zir or whatever your new pronoun is would be for political orthodoxy. It would be politically correct for its own sake for me to refer to that person as Zir. I would be adopting this new paradigm that the sort of social politics demands that one respects a person's pronoun even when they're not around. And what do you do if you don't know that person's pronoun? But that's a different question. And this is usually laden in the language of how hurtful it would be, and it was, when they found out that you did this. And so you either want to not hurt that person's feelings or you wish to be politically correct. So for the second point, this is only an obligation if one believes in political correctness or cares about the potentially hurt feelings of that particular person. For people who don't care about those hurt feelings, well, it seems unreasonable to ask them to have to care about that person's feelings. And for people who disagree with the idea of political correctness, I mean, the very notion of political correctness itself I find kind of astounding, to be honest, because the implication is that there is a form of correct politics and that the people who are politically correct are following that form of correct politics, which essentially implies that anyone who disagrees with you is simply wrong by definition when you have a political disagreement with someone. And the thing is, a person's political views are actually a reflection of their moral outlooks, it seems. And given how there's no moral law that means I have to care about everyone's feelings or I have to agree with anyone else politically, it seems that this is totally unreasonable from the perspective of someone who doesn't agree that there is a thing called that there is a form of perfect and correct politics, or that they have to be morally bound to respect the feelings of absolutely everyone on earth. So from a person who is unconcerned or opposed to political correctness, requiring that they adhere to these standards, even within the immediate presence of a non-binary individual, let alone when they're not there, could be seen as an offensive imposition on their personal autonomy. It doesn't just seem unreasonable, in fact. It seems outright tyrannical. You do not get to decide what I say about you in your absence. I think that's a fair barrier to put on someone else's claims over my behaviour. I mean, just imagine that if tomorrow you walk into the office and the person on the desk next to you decides that they were going to dress in a feathered superhero outfit every day and declared to everyone that they wanted to be called Falcon at all times. Would it seem unreasonable if the company then demanded that you would call that person Falcon upon pain of disciplinary action, and you would refer to them as a superhero when they were being referred to in absence? I mean, it doesn't just sound unreasonable, does it? It sounds ludicrous. But that's essentially what's happening when it comes to gender identity. And so the question really is, am I not the person who gets to describe how I determine how I describe someone else? Are we obliged to describe people how they would prefer? We already seem to have accepted the presupposition that we should not want to offend people. And on all of these things, I disagree. I don't think that someone else gets to describe how I determine how I describe someone else. I don't think we're obliged to describe people how they would prefer, and I don't think that we should presuppose that we should not want to offend people. Are there not some people worthy of being offended? I mean, it might even be a moral good to deliberately offend people who act like petty tyrants and try to, in some vague attempt to curb their impositions on you in the future, and on other people as well. A way of kind of socially pushing back on the idea that you are actually beholden to their will. People who make unreasonable demands can be discouraged from making unreasonable demands by simply refusing to assent to their presuppositions. And once they become aware that you simply do not share the same starting point, they will either have to persuade you or give up. For example, if the conversation between yourself and the pronoun police begins with, "We wouldn't want to offend people, would we?" If you respond with, "Actually, I think offence is a very useful social tool, and I certainly wouldn't want to take it off the table," then they cannot have the conversation with you that, when they are not around, you should use their pronouns, the pronouns of their choice, because otherwise it would be offensive. The assumption that you don't want to be offensive is the thing that we have drilled down to discuss. And sometimes you might want to be offensive. You might be dealing with someone whose views are absolutely abhorrent. They might be a child murderer or something. And they might be trying to get you to in some way consent to a position of their own. And you might completely agree. Well, I mean, some children deserve murder. No, I don't agree. Well, that you can't disagree, that's offensive. Well, I can, and maybe then you should be offended. I mean, that's a ludicrous example, but you see what I mean. It's okay to offend the child murderer if they say that if they say that arguing against child murder is offensive, well, then they can be offended, can't they? I don't care if their moral tastes are inflamed at this point. Do I care if the moral tastes of people who are using those moral tastes to, well, I mean, I don't want to say oppress because it's a common and overused word, but to, make people do as they want against their own better judgment? Do I not want to offend those people? Do I care about whether they're offended? I don't think I do. And so if we establish the sort of moral ground to reserve to ourselves the right to offend, then the entire conversation ends up becoming resolved in your favour. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be offensive. That doesn't mean you can't use their pronouns. You might choose to do it. But the point is, you don't have to do it. You shouldn't feel compelled to do it, because it is an unreasonable demand that is being made of you that at all times you must use these pronouns, or else. There is no or else. Or else what? Or else the person will be offended and hurt. Well, maybe that person should consider not making unreasonable demands of others that are a direct imposition, especially when many of those people, most of those people in fact, do not believe in political correctness and do not have a responsibility not to hurt your feelings, especially in this regard.